We're good? Oh, you can hear my voice. It's weird. It's weird hearing your own voice. Okie dokie. So last week we had a lot. We went over a lot. It was a jam-packed thing of the intertestamental period. So tonight we're still kind of going to be in there looking a little bit more at Philippi. That's the city I want to cover first. Before we start, I'm going to ask y'all, do y'all have any questions about last week, or do y'all need anything like reiterated? Richard literally came up to me. He was like, "That's a great class," and part of me was like, "Yeah," and then he was like, "You could have made 2." I was like, "Ooh, I put too much in it." So if there's anything, I kind of got some slides, briefly going over it, but leave it up to y'all. If y'all had something y'all wanted specifically asked before we looked at Philippi, Chris has got a mic back there, so just raise your hands real fast. Anybody? Nope. We're good? Okay. Again, Chris has got the mic back there just in general for the class. And tonight we're going to look at Philippi. So one of the first things I kind of wanted to talk about again, a lot of people were very confused, like the Punic Wars, Macedonian Wars, and all that. So clarification, or kind of just showing, was the dates. I wanted to show the dates and show how close these wars were tied to each other. Because again, Rome's not an empire yet. Jeff, I'm sorry, I'm talking about Rome. That's yours. I'm going to be talking about Rome a little bit for tonight. So it's not an empire yet. It's still a republic, but they're fighting on two fronts. They're fighting, Carthage is they got a lot on the North African area. So they're fighting below. They're fighting up northeast against Macedonia. So they prevailed. They win. They get to be the legs of the statue. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the Koine Greek replacing the classical Greek, because Richard and I had a little conversation about that. So I actually looked a little bit more into it, because we were both kind of talking like it was like a melting pot. It was like a melting pot. And what a lot of people have actually looked at and studied, and I was very surprised. There's about 9 different type of classical Greek dialects around the time. And remember last week I talked about how Philip had this weird fascination with Athens. He loved Athens. The Athenians spoke a type called it looks like the word Attic. It's bad map. It's very small. They're in the pink. And there was another one called Ionic. That's what Homer spoke. So when you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's Ionic Greek. Well, Koine is actually comprised mostly of those two. And so you see this map, all the different other colors. Those were all the different dialects under the time of Philip II. This is basically why Alexander basically merged mainly Attic and Ionic Greek with some forms of the others that came up with Koine. That's why when you look in history, we're able to look and understand a lot more of Athenian philosophy and a lot of areas that spoke Ionic more than Thebes and Sparta. It's because it's more closely related to the Koine, which was fun when you learn about it. It's also weird. The last thing I also want to bring up, Jeff and I kind of talked about this because I mentioned Daniel. The oldest copy of Daniel is dated for 100 BC, but that's a Septuagint text. A funny thing about that is the Septuagint is a copy of the Hebrew. So there's an unfound older Hebrew copy. And Jewish tradition talks about how when Alexander was actually coming through Judea, the Jewish high priest pointed to Daniel 8 saying, "You're that one-horned goat." That's Jewish tradition, but you look it up, the high priest around that time basically said, "You're the one-horned goat." And Alex was like, "Cool, I'm going to go keep conquering. Have a good day." Didn't really bother for the four-horn type goat. Again, that's a legend, so take it with a grain of salt. I bring this up because 100 BC doesn't sound that long. The oldest copy that we have of the Torah, so that's Genesis and Exodus and all that, is from 600 BC. And so the Torah does not start in 600 BC, does it? No, but I just thought I would kind of clarify because some people might have misinterpreted what I said about Daniel, about the age of the text. And then some fun facts. Alexander the First, he was the king while they were a vassal state. Proved Greek lineage during the Olympic Games. He said he was a descendant of Hercules. It worked, so he gets to participate, and that's how Macedonia gets partial recognition. Alexander the Great, we'll talk about later, he did have a son. He didn't have an heir, but he had a son. His son was too young, sadly, actually. And the other two, we'll just skip, and I'll talk about these later when we get to it, for the sake of time. And so we're here. This is where we're at, Macedonia. We're going to talk about Philippi. So what do we know about Philippi? So according to tradition, the city under its first name was, I can never say this, Creadius or Datum, and was founded in 600 BC by settlers from nearby Thais. So let me catch up with my notes. Yeah. So when the original city was attacked by a neighboring chariot, I can never say that, Thracians, that inhabited the Thracians, the inhabitants looked to Philip II of Macedon for protection. So remember, Philip is very important in this time period. And Philip's very important for Philippi because the city maintained its independence because of Philip. And sure as continued to be continued and was loyal to him. And basically, Philippi is named after Philip. Now, why is that kind of funny? Like father, like son, Alexander starts going around naming cities after him like Philip. So it's fun history when you look at it. And according to the ancient historian Diodorus, the mines near Philippi produce a very respectable 1,000 talents of gold each year. So when we look into the scriptures next week, when we understand how wealthy and how giving the people of Philippi are, part of it is because of the region. They're close to Neapolis, which is a harbor town, but they also are close to a gold mine in a sense of resources. So it's very beneficial if you live there. I would love to live near a gold mine. Wouldn't you? So the fall of the empire, and we're looking mainly at the Macedonian Empire. So do we remember the Macedonian Wars from last week? No, it was a lot. But essentially what happens? Anybody? Bueller?
Macedonia kind of provoked Rome,
Mm-hmm.
and eventually Rome has enough of Macedonia just provoking them through trying to cut off their trade, I think, and other things like that.
So how did they provoke? What was the main issue with Rome that provoked them?
Trade route, but I can't remember.
It wasn't, that was later on. The main thing was the Punic Wars. That's a very important thing. They sided with Carthage at the time of the Punic Wars. And so Rome said, no dice. We're not friends no more. I'm going to get you. And so it's very important because when the Romans defeated the Macedonians at the Battle of Penned, if I can never say that right, this is why I'm not a historian, Pentidian in 168 BC, they divided it into the 4 administrative districts. Remember, that's the third Macedonian war we talked about, so this is kind of a good bit in towards the end. 4 districts. It's never stated, but Philippi is thought by historians to be the first district zone of these administrative states. It shows how important Rome looked at Philippi. And you look later on how the Romans treated Philippi. They weren't a free city like Thessalonica was, but they garnered a lot of privileges that other captive cities would have loved. They still had to pay tributes, but it wasn't as bad. It was called the Prima Regia, though, the first district zone, and it's always implied when you look at historical texts to be the region of Philippi.
So you're saying because it was the first region, they had more freedom?
Again, it's a very confusing one. It's not because it's the first region. It's more so because of the resources and location, probably. Because, again, Thessalonica has not yet been created. And as we look in Acts 16, when you read the Greek of how they describe Philippi is talked as like a big city, but not the capital city, because that's Thessalonica. But Philippi is a big city, very important region, just in general. So it's not the capital, but they look at it as with an important, view, a strategic view. And then 146 BC, Macedonia became a single Roman province. So remember, I talked about how after the Fourth Macedonian War, Rome had enough. Rome just had enough, and they said, you are under our control. You get no more privileges, Macedonia. You're our first province. That's why when you look back in the maps, it expands from its original territory. The city benefited greatly from the construction of the Via Egenta. I can never say that right. Egnatia, that's right. So what kind of road is this? Why is this road important?
That's how Paul was able to go on his missionary journey using those roads.
Yeah, so that's how Paul went on his missionary journeys. Remember, if you got a comment, just raise your hand real fast so people at home can hear it. But yeah, that's one of the ways Paul traveled. It was also the main connective road between Europe and Asia Minor. So it became one of the first major trade roads.
And the Ignatian Way is still standing.
It's still standing today, yep.
It is still there. It's amazing to see what they had, what they were able to accomplish.
Yeah. But again, if Rome never did this, would we have the Ignatian Way? So we possibly might not have the Ignatian Way. We might have another way. But we're seeing how God is playing behind the scenes to creating the roads and the structure for the gospel to eventually come about in the first century and how it spreads. This is why I like history because, like I was saying last week, this is the ultimate dad joke. The middle of the statue, it's not in Scripture, but it's in Scripture. It's all, this part of history is always referenced either to confirm things of the past in the Old Testament or to show how the prophecies led to be for Christ and how it sets it up. So it's the ultimate dad joke because it's there, but it's not there. My clicker, there we go. Yeah. So the Battle of Philippi, this is very important. So do you remember the Ides of March? What are the Ides of March? Remember the Ides of March? Julius Caesar. What happens on the Ides of March, Mr. Man? He was stabbed to death by the Roman Senate. So during this time, there was no emperor, but he basically kind of, if I remember this correctly, took over and became consulate consecutively. You're not supposed to do that. You become a consul for a certain term, and then you give it up, and you don't run for a while, something on those lines. He basically became what was called a dictator. Because the people loved his policies, basically a populist type person. The Senate didn't like that. They hadn't been ruled by a king for all, so the Ides of March happened. And so this spurs what we called the Roman Civil War. And so this leads kind of because of Macedon's vacuum of power. Macedonia's vacuum of power, not there no more, can't make the region stable. Rome starts taking over. They don't want a king similar to how Macedonia had it, similar to how Persia, Media, Babylon, they don't want that. And so the Senate kind of takes their own hands into it. Now, in 42 BC, the city famously gave its name to the battle that saw Mark Antony and Octavian gain revenge over Julius Caesar's brutal against their assassins of Brutus and Cassius. So who remembers reading Shakespearean plays in high school? They were one of my favorites, and then when I found out it was Shakespeare, I felt a little embarrassed. I was like, oh, I'm a nerd. I'm super nerdy, apparently. So who here read or knows of the tragedy of Julius Caesar? The Ides of March is a famous line from that play. And that's what that's talking about, is the Civil War. It was so famous that even Shakespeare himself wrote a play about it, even millennia afterwards. That's how captivating and how earth-changing this is. Again, it links back because the Battle of Philippi, this region takes hold of the battle that becomes the empire. So it kind of also shows that Philippi is not just important in the sense of resources, of wealth, of where its location is, but also it's the turning point of the empire. So it's very important. And then there's two battles. There's two main battles. And the first one is basically Mark Antony versus Cassius and Octavian versus Brutus. And it ends in a draw, kind of. So what happens is that Mark Antony is this brilliant military strategist, but he's a dummy when it comes to politics. He has no idea what politics are. And he starts getting jealous of Octavian. During this period, they've also made a kind of temporary truce before the battle happens with the killers of Caesar. But again, Mark Antony gets jealous and starts causing basically like what we call our children a hissy fit. He's making a hissy fit because he's not getting all, the accolades like Octavian is. Octavian's going around being strategic. He's getting alliances. And Brutus and Cassius, they're just like, we don't care. We've done our job. And so because of this, he makes a bigger strife, and he actually cuts off and ends the truce between the killers of Caesar. So they flee. They go all the way out to Philippi. I wish I put the map in here, but the way it's mainly Brutus and Cassius by this point. They set up a line straight with Neapolis, which is the harbor. They set up a line. One camp is Cassius, one is Brutus. Cassius gets killed by Brutus. Gets killed by Mark Antony. Mark Antony, again, a genius. He's the best general since Caesar. Under Caesar, better than Pompey, they would say, but he died fast. Brutus, on the other hand, is cowering. He is not good at fighting. He is like a 20-year-old, doesn't know what's going on. Teams up with Antony again. They take on Cassius, and Antony's parading around like a hero. He's finally getting the accolades that he wants after the second battle. Plutarch even states it so much in his volumes of history. He basically said in no uncertain terms, Octavian did nothing worth relating. All the success and victory was Antony's. So this is the first emperor. And even one of the most prominent historians is even saying he's a coward. He did nothing. But what does Octavian do? He's going around again. He's making political alliances. He's playing behind the scenes. These are the things that, if you don't remember, they learned from Macedonian history from Philip II. Philip II, he wasn't just a conquering king. They learned from history. Philip, he would destroy your neighboring city and then come to you and say, hey, do you see what I did to Thebes? You want that? No? Cool. We're friends. Have a great day. He did that constantly. And Octavian kind of learned from that. He learned also from another person around this time, or not around this time, but a little bit after, Cassander. And we'll talk about him when we talk about Thessalonica, because he's very important for the founding of Thessalonica. So now we are in the Roman period. So again, the aftermath, Philippi then became a Roman colony, settled by army veterans and produced its own coinage. After Octavian defeated Mark Antony in 31 BC, the city saw a big influx of new residents. And I'm going to ask, what do you think the new residents were? Army veterans. But who else? Not just Romans, but which Romans? Well, if there's a civil war and half of the people support one person, the other half don't, and your guy dies, do you want to stay in Rome? So a lot of Antony supporters, it's believed, went all the way to Philippi. But that's also important too, because there was a Jewish community in Philippi, but this was what garnered a lot more of the Gentiles. When Paul comes around, there's more Gentiles than Jews. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But Paul reached out to the Gentiles in his preachings on those 3 Sabbaths. They saw him, as we'll talk about. They heard the word. It helped spread it beyond Israel. And from 27 BC, the city gained the honorary title of Colonial Lue Augusta I can't say that word. It's very inappropriate. But basically, it's a fancy title, basically saying it's the first colony of Augustus. So any thoughts? We're about to talk a little bit about the first century, about what's going on. Nothing? Pretty.
It's good to know that it was a Gentile community
Mhm.
Paul came in and spoke.
And another thing I'm trying to pave with this is, again, when we look in Philippians, what are they known for? We'll kind of talk about it here in a bit, but that's something to keep in mind. What are the Philippians known for within the Scripture? Paul says it in 3 different texts. So this is the map of the second missionary journey with Paul. He doesn't go first to Philippi. He goes all the way through. It's towards the end. But next week, we'll look at it. We're going to look more at Acts 16. The city during the New Testament. Philippi, the Philippi of Paul's day was situated in a plain on the banks of a deep, rapid stream called Ganget. This is why I'm not a historian, because I can't say the words. If you can't say the words, you can't be a historian. Now the Angista. The ancient walls follow the course of the stream from some distance, and in this section of the wall, the site of a gate is seen, and the name the gate is seen with the ruins of a bridge nearly opposite. And some think that when we're reading Acts 16, the gate that Paul is actually preaching at is this gate that is still up. And it's because there was no real synagogue during the time of Philippi, during the time of the travels. There was nowhere for them to congregate, but so they were allowed to basically stand outside this gate. This is how the Gentiles actually heard the word over these 3 Sabbaths. On the southeast, a rocky ridge, some 1,600 feet in height, separated the plain from the bay and the town of Neapolis. So why is that important? What is significant about Neapolis? Is it in Macedonia? It means new city, but it's also over it ran paved roads connecting Philippi to Neapolis, and though the distance between the two was 9 miles, Neapolis was to Philippi what the Piraeus was to Athens. It's Piroeus. I can never say these words. And Paul is said when journeying from Greece to Syria to have sailed away from Philippi, that is, from Neapolis, its ports. So we're seeing, again, some of the history coming about, trying to set the mood for when we actually read next week passages of the text. It's believed that the first Christian church in Europe was founded at Philippi, built on a tomb of a Hellenistic hero. So why is that kind of important, built on the tomb of a Hellenistic hero? Why is that? I don't know.
Well, since we know that the church was established in Philippi,
Philippi is only veterans. So since we know it's veterans, very could be, some of the veterans who became Christians be built upon the tomb of a Hellenistic hero.
Yeah, that's one thought. Any other thoughts about why it's significant? Again, I don't know of the significance. But when everything that I read about when it talks about this first potential church, they always want to emphasize that it was built upon a Hellenistic hero. And so something I think of is it's kind of an imagery of God showing that he is superior to the false gods, building the temple. That's one way that you can look at it. But again, it could just be that they liked the building. It was fancy, and they said, we'll make a church out of it. And it became a very important city in the early Christian century following the visit of Paul. So again, first church in Europe. What else is the first that we'll read next week? What happens in Acts 16 specifically? Now I'm putting you on the spot. Lydia, yep. Philippian jailer. These are things that, again, while we study history, it helps us build a better understanding of the environment that Paul is in. So these people of Philippi, they have generations among generations, fighting. They were a powerful kingdom before that became a powerful empire. They have, remnants of descendants of Mark Antony supporters. They have remnants and veterans from far away. And yet they were probably one of the most giving congregations, churches ever. This is something I was trying to allude to earlier. They alone, of all the churches of the time, sent subsidies to relieve Paul of temporal necessities. What that means is they basically funded the missionary work. You see it in Philippians 4:10, and then verse 15 and 18. You see it in 2 Colossians 11:9. You see it in, I said second there, I meant 1 Thessalonians 2:2. You see Paul is constantly, of all the churches he goes to, he talks about how great they are. And this is something that we'll talk about next week. Who here knows of the Apostolic Fathers? Who are they? The Apostolic Fathers are the people that are basically after the apostles. So one of them is Polycarp. I'm not going to read it today, but I'll read it next week. Polycarp, he actually wrote a letter to the Philippians. And it's really sad when you read that letter towards the end. What he mentions is completely opposite of what we see at the Philippian congregation when Paul was missionarying. There's a individual, I think, if I had the book in front of me, I remember it's like Bayless. It starts with a B. He's basically the leader of the congregation. He's the bishop. And he and other leaders of the congregation, of the church at that moment, don't want to give as much as they used to. And Polycarp in his letter is essentially wondering why this is. And he mentions how Paul used to brag about you all the time. Yet here we are, letters written, it's thought to be between 135 to 137. You have forgotten your ways. You have begun to not support the mission work no more when we need it the most. During this period, around the 2nd century, is when the Gnostic movement is beginning its growth. The Valentinians, by the 2nd century, make their own what's called the canon, a Gnostic canon. You see this alluded to in 1st and 2nd Peter. You see it alluded to, obviously, in the 1st and 2nd epistles of John. You see it constantly alluded to about the false teachings. Part of the way to fight back against the false teachings, and sometimes we don't like to admit it, is to give support, to give cheerfully. And I bring this up because we're tight spot, obviously, in today's world. But when we read this week, I'm sending everyone a homework assignment after the class, so don't get mad at me. But after you read, you'll see that even in the toughest times with the Philippians, they were cheerful givers up to a certain point. And when they stopped their giving, the false teaching was able to spread rapidly. It wasn't until the 4th century, a little bit of the 4th century, when you had the Council of Nicaea come about to make their canon to fight against this false doctrine, the Gnostics. And it does stem from Philippi, because Philippi supported the apostles so much for the travels. They were one of the few churches that Paul taught joyfully about. He gave doctrinal, corrections in there, but it's more so of how to be a joyful Christian. Unlike we see with the Corinthians of, hey, don't sleep with your dad's wife, or don't talk about your spiritual gifts, or things like that. They were more so of, be sure to remember the joy that God gave you. When someone new comes in, I can never say his name, starts with an E, who Paul sent some. We'll talk about him next week. I can never. What was that? Epaphras. See, this is why I'm not a historian. Epaphras, to take him in a way he's showing and he's emphasizing the importance of being a joyful greeter, a joyful, host to your brother who's coming to teaching the word. And so we have about 7 minutes left. And so before I give everyone's homework assignment, I just want to get y'all's thoughts about the history. Because again, there's a lot to it.
I think one thing is, it's really profound when you bring up Acts 16, it just clicked for me. See, because I think a lot of what you brought, it was a lot of information, right? And so it's a history that, it's been a long time since I've gone through this history, so it's been good to hear it, but a lot of it is it's a lot of information. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you made the connection to Acts 16. Why were they beaten and put in prison? Mm-hmm. Because the people, you mentioned, they're veterans of the military, of the Roman military. They are, they're connected to that civil war of the side that won. Mm-hmm. That means everything when he casts out the demon of the girl that was the fortune teller. And they lose their money, they drag them. It was like a citizen's arrest. They drag Paul and Silas before the magistrate, and the magistrate beats them. I mean, you gave us the background to understand why that happened.
And another thing, too, about the magistrate thing, they had been a very stable period. Again, when you think about the mission work of Jesus, did he go as far out of Judea? Did he go as far out? He went to Tyre, but that's compared to where the Apostle Paul, as we look at these studies where he went, as far as he went, he never made it to Rome, which Jeff will talk about when I'm done, or he never went to Ephesus. He never went to these regions. So these people probably don't even know that much about the Jewish background. They are probably hearing about this guy. One of the things that to take into consideration is that their emperor at the time, Octavian, is a son of God. He's a son of Julius Caesar, who is a deified being. And so when they're hearing this, they're kind of, oh, we have a deified son too, Octavian. And they're very patriotic. And so when they kind of hear the Jewish version of it, they're very taken aback. They're like, whoa, this is kind of insulting at first, in a possible sense. Another sense is they probably accept it. They probably, something about the Romans that they did was they tried to convert your pantheon into theirs. It's like, oh, well, Hermes is Mercury, Jupiter is Zeus, we're all good. But this is something that they're hearing for the first time when Paul visits. And if you're a Jewish individual in that region, you probably don't want to talk about Jesus that much, just because you know how the Romans ended that. Any other thoughts? Stanley Manley over there's got his hand raised.
It also brings to bear the reason why he said, I'm a Roman citizen, because they understood,
what it meant to be a Roman, but with them being, veterans of Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are in Greece, but, they understood the implications.
Yeah, Paul Wyndham, we were actually talking about it this morning. I never really thought about it. He said, how did Paul die? I was like, I can't think of it on the top of my head. How did he die? He died by beheading. I was like, okay. He said, why wasn't he crucified? Peter's crucified. A lot of people. And I was like, I don't know. He was Roman. And they were like, if you're Roman, you get a quick death. You get a merciful death. You don't have to suffer. You're not Roman. Well, we're gonna make you suffer. And we're gonna make sure other people see it. So Paul, he was kind of blessed for his journeys. And in a way, his martyrdom at the end, he got a quick one. God found a really good tool. He was able to communicate, and he was able to build the funds. And Philippi is a good example of how to support our missionary works. It's a way of which how the church helps and shows how to help our missionary work. So here's the homework assignment. I want everyone to read these by the time we get here next week because we're talking about them. So I will be definitely discussing Acts 16. That's Paul's second missionary journey. I'd say read the first part of Acts 20 because he goes back to Macedonia. A lot of people forget that. He goes back for a brief minute and then they remember, oh, hey, that's Paul. And so he leaves real fast. He lives kind of like the next day or two. But that interaction, it's very reminiscent of how Christians are today in America are starting being treated and how we see Christians in the other parts of the world when it's called to be a Christian, how stigmatized they are and how they sometimes have to flee for their safety. The epistles of Philippians, it's just 4 or 5 small little chapters. You can get it done within an hour. It's a very good read. You'll love it. And then a fun optional one is the letter of Polycarp. And again, that's a very sad one towards the end.
How would you recommend people access that?
You can find the letter of Polycarp on a PDF for free. You can just search for it, letter of Polycarp PDF free, and you should be able to find it. Again, it might be a Catholic website or an Orthodox church website, but again, that's part of their canon. And so it's kind of a part of a required reading in a sense for at least the priesthood to read those. But you can find those online. But Polycarp's letter, he talks, a lot of it when you read it too, this letter, it sounds like he's just mimicking different scriptures. You'll hear verses and you say, oh, that sounds like something from 1 Thessalonians. That sounds like something from Corinthians. But then when he gets to the main point, to the Philippians of what happened to the giving, why have you stopped supporting, it's a gut-wrenching kind of. It's a warning of how a church can be today. Again, it's not, I wouldn't say like it's 100%, be scriptural, keep it, but it's a good historical document to look at. With that being said, we are literally at time. Jeff, could you lead us in a closing prayer?
Let's pray. Dear Father, Lord, thank you so much for this evening that you bless us with, this opportunity we've had, Lord, to just learn about your word, to learn about the history of the time period in which we received these letters, Lord, that we have in your word, and just so grateful to better understand what the people of that time period were going through and what these churches were dealing with and the adversities and struggles that Paul and his fellow companions were going through, Lord. Just pray that as we learn these things, Lord, that we'll be able to be inspired by their faith and by their endurance and take from their example in all these things, Lord, and help be able to better explain these things, Lord, to others. Thank you for all the love you shared with us, Lord, and thank you for your Son, Jesus, and we pray. Amen.